do this either mentally or if you have pen and paper, do it pen and paper. So for 30 seconds, I want you to create as many words as you can create with this structure. So I will keep track of time starting now. Okay, that's time. Did anybody actually write them down? I got a couple of achievers in the front. I like it. In the pseudo front. It's not the real front, it's the front you've created. Nobody wants to be in the real front, so I appreciate that. How many words did you get? 6 and 5. Okay. Anybody think they got more than that? So we got someone in the back. How much did you get? 7. Okay. So somewhere between 6 and 10 is what most people can do in 30 seconds. Can you just tell me your list of words?
Pay, pan, net, change, gray, red.
Okay. So where did you get change?
C-H-A-N-G.
So you went here, here.
Oh, that'd be connected?
Here. All right. So you're proving my point, the reason I do this.
Okay.
So crew here knows the game Boggle. Usually it's the older crowd these days, but I used to play Boggle all the time as a kid. So Boggle has within it a set of rules. So if you've played the game Boggle and you've grown skills at doing this in the world of Boggle and the confinements of the game, you have to make a few compromises. One is every word has to be more than 2 letters. The letters have to be connected to each other in some way, and you can't go back and forth with your letters. So you can't come up here and then go back again and come back around. And you can only use each letter once. You can't bounce around. So those are the confines that the rules of Boggle put upon us. If you've never played Boggle, or maybe you forgot the rules because you've been playing a bunch, you don't have that confinement around you. You don't have a rule structure to operate in. So you bounce all over the board. So you're doing, you're using letters over here, using letters over here, using letters over there. You can make way more words if you don't operate in that rule structure. But you still operated under some rules. That's the English language. You chose to use English. Nobody said English had to be the word you use. Nobody said you had to use a language of any kind. You could have made up a language and made whatever words you wanted to. The point of this test is that if you don't limit yourself by the rules that surround you, you can really do a lot more creative things, and you can become more creative in your work environment. And only by recognizing that you operate under boundaries and structures and then breaking down those boundaries can we kind of create big innovations and big changes. So if you look at all the monumental, not evolutionary, but revolutionary changes that happen, it's because someone decided to ignore the rules. So I encourage you through this talk and through the things you do in your life to think about, are the rules around me binding me in a way that's not helpful? So I was given a gift by the internet before this talk today, because this talk is about how we perceive the world and function in it differently from other people. And this came along. So who's seen this? Some of us have been locked in this place for a week and maybe missed it. So this is a little audio game, and I want you to listen to it, and I'll adjust the volume and play it again if I need to.
Laurel.
All right, let me play with the volume here. They make this really hard to turn.
Laurel. 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 Laurel.
Who hears Yanny related to that? Who hears Laurel? So we're a Yanny dominant crowd, and we have some Laurels out there. So there's actually some science behind it. So this came out on the internet, basically blew up on Twitter a few days ago, and it's already done. Like it had its 72 hours on Twitter. We don't have much attention span anymore. So the science behind this is that whether you hear Laurel or Yanny depends on a couple of things, a few things. The biggest one being your own hearing. So if you, the word yanny, I should say the frequencies of the word, if you hear yanny, are higher. So people who have higher frequency hearing loss lose those high frequencies and the word becomes laurel. People who have not experienced the English language will hear the word differently. And then it's the sound environment itself, the acoustics can impact which frequencies get resonated better. So some people might hear yanny in one setting of the world in another setting. So your perception can change just based on where you're hearing this word come up. And one of the keys to it is there's no context for the word. The reason it's confusing and the reason we hear different things is because the word's not stated in a contextual sentence. So this was a series of words that were read to help interpreters learn sign language. And so they used sign language interpreters to read this series of words, and so they were all isolated, and that's where this word is discovered. They have this really different perception based on who you are. So a lot of what we're talking about today is this. It's that two people can experience the same thing in a different way. So this is the environment we work in. This might get loud as well. I'll play the volume if I need to.
Curious to catch your heart, because I hired and wait as I required and I was all tired. The rocky road to double and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Hunt a hare and turn her down the rocky road all the way to double and whack Balaliga. And double and next the road and down the
So this is the world we work in on a daily basis. We're throwing twists and turns all the time. And that can be a really stressful environment. Thank you. Sorry about that. That can be a really stressful environment to function in, and it can really impact the way that we behave. Oh, this is so much better on my voice. I wish I would have done it earlier. So I want to talk a little bit about how we can impact the way we educate and teach in this environment. First of all, I think a lot of our learners, and I think probably many of us are guilty of this as well, treat our brains like this. Learning's become a really passive task. How many people here listen to podcasts? How many people believe that's an acceptable way to educate themselves? Honestly, I mean, I do. But I think you have to recognize that it's not the same as reading a book. How many people listen to audiobooks? So I'm a huge audiobook person, but I fully acknowledge that I probably get about 2/3 or 3/4 of the book retained compared to if I read it. So I listen to audiobooks because I run a lot, and it's like my justification for running. I can study while I run. But that's passive learning. It's what a lot of people want is they want us to give them their information. There's a big movement on flipped classroom. Flipped classroom is great, but it requires active learners. So I encourage the people we teach and ourselves to think of things more like this. The active learner. Treat our brains like athletes treat their bodies. Usain Bolt didn't go to the track and jog around a 400-meter track a couple of times, call it a day and go home. The same thing for anyone who runs or participates in any sports. If you go out, get your heart rate up to about 120 for 30 minutes and come home, you will never get better. You will stay healthy probably, but you're not going to get faster, you're not going to get stronger, you're just going to maintain health. So why do we think that learning's any different? So the mantra I like is that learning takes effort and learning is hard. And if you're not working while you learn, you're probably not learning. You're just kind of putting the information through your brain and letting it go out the other side. So we'll start by talking just a little bit about how we attain memories and information. And it seems simplistic, but the first thing is just sensory input. So we have a sensory input, typically our eyes, sometimes our ears, that comes in through our brain and goes into working memory. Our working memory is that classic 5 to 7 digit processing that we do when we remember a phone number, when we spot off labs to somebody. That's our working memory. So for us, we have context when we use our memory to do things like treat a patient with CHF, and we say, I want to, CBC, BMP, BNP, chest X-ray. I want them on BiPAP, start a nitro drip at 200. We have context because we've seen it before, but when we tell that to a brand new medical student, that's all new information for them. So after you tell it to them, they have to be like CBC, BMP, chest X-ray, trope, and then the nurse says, hey, can you help me boost this patient up? And you give the patient a little boost in the bed, and then the med student goes CBC, he wanted a chest X-ray, and it's gone, because for a second they broke that processing work of working memory. So only by reciting working memory multiple times over and over can we actually get that put into long-term memory. But long-term memory, theorists believe, requires a couple other things. And one is repetition, the other is rest. So many people believe that your working memory turns into long-term memory when you rest at night, when you sleep. So what do we do to our medical students and residents? We don't let them sleep. We disrupt their cycles all the time. In my previous life, I was an Army Ranger, and Ranger school is notorious for that. Like they put you in this 6 to 8 week hell course, and they don't let you sleep, and they keep you awake the entire time. You get, on average, about 2 hours of sleep a night, and you'll go multiple days without sleeping. And they think somehow that's a better learning environment. So we've learned some from these mistakes in the way that we train and educate our medical students. Welcome to the latecomers. I like it. Nice shirt. When we switched to the 80-hour work week, what we found actually is our students aren't really learning and working more to become better physicians. They're spending more time relaxing and having fun. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but we have to recognize that that intervention didn't have the consequence we thought it would. So I wouldn't say that our students are actually getting even more rest. They don't sleep any more than they did, our residents, I should say. They don't sleep any more than they did when they worked 100 hours a week. They just play more. So they stay out later. Instead of being on call at the hospital, they're on call at home with their friends. I think there are other health benefits to that, but I think another important thing to recognize. So when we start out, this is the brain of our novices. So this is the brain of our medical students and our interns. So July is coming up. This is going to be your intern. So when your intern's seeing that CHF patient and they walk into the room, they know that you have to do a bunch of stuff to the patient, but they have to look for it all. So like back under here is the chest X-ray, and the nitroglycerin's hiding over here. They don't really remember the dosing you want to do for acute decompensated heart failure, so they have to like dig through here to find the right dosing. And then the BMP's over here, the CBC's there. So they're going all over their messy room trying to find all the knowledge they've accumulated that just hasn't been built into an hierarchical structure yet. When we advance to the second or third year, we start to build our heuristics. So heuristics are the shortcuts that we use to retain information in a more meaningful way. Is anybody familiar with memory athletes? So these are like the people who will recite off hundreds of numbers in a row from a random list. So they can memorize a list of numbers and then recite it back on hundreds. It might actually be thousands now. And the way they do this is they compartmentalize the numbers into meaningful statements. So they create sentence structure out of the numbers, and different numbers mean different things. And they remember the sentences and translate them to numbers. The same way that when you treat a CHF patient, they're not all the components of CHF anymore. They're this little box, and everything fits in that box. So when you're working with medical students and junior residents, when you're seeing 7 or 8 patients and they're stuck on one, it's because you're seeing 7 or 8 compartments. One patient takes up 7 or 8 mental spaces for them to take care of a single patient. So I think I say this mostly to have pity on them a little bit. The cognitive work that you put into one patient is nothing compared to the cognitive work they put into one patient. And then finally, we get into our advanced, either senior residents. I think a lot of I'm in a 4-year program, a lot of our 3rd-year residents think they're at this stage. So this is the stage where you think you know more than you know. It's that stage of ignorance. And they think they've got it all figured out and they're ready to go into the real world. Then they moonlight a couple of times and they come back and they're like, okay, I got more to learn. But this is the stage where you recognize when the problem doesn't fit the solution that you gave it. And I think we most commonly see this in the emergency department at sign-out on night shifts. So I worked a decade of all nights, and I would tell people at sign-out, I'm an impaired physician now. I haven't slept in oftentimes 20 hours. if something I'm doing to a patient seems wrong, say something and correct the problem. Typically, we do this after the other doctor leaves, right? The attending and the resident team from the overnight leaves, and you're like, we're going to change all the things they did for that patient. I recommend you at least see the patient before you recommend changes. But this is kind of the advanced phase now where we can troubleshoot problems and we can find new solutions where they weren't there when they weren't there before. I'm going to spend a minute talking about System 1 and System 2 learning because this goes into the kind of the whole burrito of cognitive overload. So who's familiar with System 1 and System 2? We got a few in the back. So this comes from Kahneman and Tversky, two researchers. They were, really created the field of behavioral economics. Before the field of behavioral economics came out, people believed that we all made rational decisions in every choice in our life. We all know in medicine that's clearly not true, but economists who created all these economic models believe that. And Amos and Tversky proved that that's not really the case, and they wrote a book together. They wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, and that's what this concept's from. So the definitions of System 1, so this is System 1. System 1 is your fast processing brain. It's your brain that does things without thinking. Some people say it's your lizard brain. It's the brain that uses all the heuristics we've developed as we mature and solves problems rapidly. So two characteristics of it is it's easy and fast, and then the other characteristic is there's no effort you can put into it to make it faster. So you can't work harder on 2 + 2 and solve the problem faster. You just know the answer and it just pops out of your head. So that's System 1. This is System 2. So System 2 is a more complex problem. The components that define it are it takes effort and time, and if we work in practice, we can do it faster. And if you process things enough, you can turn a System 2 into a System 1. Our brains are inherently lazy. Our brains are one of the biggest consumers of calories by weight of any organ in our body. Our brains have evolved over time to always revert to System 1 when they have the opportunity. And I'll talk about some of the times when you revert to System 1 as we go through the rest of this talk. So System 1, quick and easy. System 2, complex and takes effort. So we'll play a little game, and I'll have you guys follow along here. I'm just going to control my volume if I need to. So this is a game called Add 1, and this will be just a quick little demonstration of your System 2 and how it can rapidly overload you.
See your System 2 in action? I'll show you a string of 4 digits, you read them aloud, then add 1 to each of the original digits. If the card reads 3795, the correct response would be 4806. We'll then go to the next card and you'll do the same, followed by the next card. Ready? Go.
Play along.
Few people can cope with more than 4 digits, but even harder is add 3. The interesting bit is that though your pupils would have dilated, you often become effectively blind when you fully engage System 2. Did you notice the color of the text change? Or how about the fact that the numbers completely changed when I put them off to the side? Listen to the...
Okay, so that is your System 2. So what that game does is it puts you into cognitive overdrive with a really simple math problem. And as you play it along, it goes faster and faster. So if you're like, oh, I didn't really feel stressed by that, it'll keep accelerating, kind of like a treadmill that keeps getting faster until finally you break. And what's interesting about it is that it's really easy to play this at home or in the office if you're a cognitive nerd like me. But you can just take your iPhone and set it up in a book and record somebody's pupils. And as soon as they start the problem, you'll see their pupils just blow up. We did this in the office when I was first learning about this. And at the time, my APD was Rebecca Babalek. If anybody knows her, she's the PD at UCLA now. She was an engineer by training originally, actually was an engineer for a few years in practice before she went to medical school. Math is a second language to her. When she would do this, you would see her process the problem, and then her pupil would go back down as soon as she finished the string of 3. So she could actually take like mental breaks in between each number. And then I did it to one of our administrative assistants who math is not a thing that she does on a regular basis in any complex way. And her pupils blew up instantly and just stayed lit the whole time for the entire process. And then she quit pretty rapidly. And what's interesting is you can see people quit because their pupils go down before they admit that they quit. So it's kind of fun to be like, you just stopped doing the game, didn't you? And they're like, how do you know? It's like, because your pupils are no longer dilated. So that's System 2. And what happens with system 2 is you lose a sense of what's going on around you. The other thing to keep in mind is that when we're immersed in system 2, we shut out other things. And sometimes that other thing can be someone who's not immersed in system 2 telling you what's going on with another patient. So it's another warning in the emergency department. So when you're taking care of that level 1 trauma that rolled in, and the nurse comes in and says, hey, that patient that we're sending upstairs on BiPAP, they don't look so good. I think they might need to be intubated. And you're like, I got to put in this chest tube. Just get them upstairs. That's somebody who's not cognitively overloaded trying to help you out and take some of your cognitive load for you and help you from doing something bad to a patient. It's really hard when we're in the zone of influence of cognitive overload to listen to what's going on outside of our zone. So it's important when someone's coming to you with a warning to just take a minute and say, let me go look at what happens, or what happened to that patient. We do QI cases in our department on a monthly basis, and I would say at least a third of our cases are patient goes to OBS, vital signs trend badly, several calls go to the provider from the PA who's working in OBS, provider never goes to see the patient, patient goes upstairs and crashes. So it's important when people are helping you out to allow them to help. So this is another cognitive overload demonstration. If you've seen any version of this, please still play along. If you've seen this exact one, don't tell the answer. It's a little dated, but I think it still gets its point across.
The monkey business illusion. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the ball. The correct answer is 16 passes. Did you spot the gorilla? For people who haven't seen or heard about a video like this before, about half missed the gorilla. If you knew about the gorilla, you probably saw it. But did you notice the curtain changing color or the player on the black team leaving the game? Let's rewind and watch it again. Here comes the gorilla, and there goes a player, and the curtain is changing from red to gold. When you're looking for a gorilla, you often miss other unexpected events.
So by show of hands, for those who are here for the whole video, just everyone put their hands up.
That's the monkey business illusion.
Everyone's hands up. All right, who got all the passes correct?
And the original gorilla.
If you did, keep your hand up. Who saw the curtain change color? Who saw the player leave the game? Who's never seen, have you seen this video before? All right, so, oh, I know you have. So have you seen this before? All right, so we got 2 in the room who caught everything. That's pretty good. When they originally did the study, I think I get much lower results on who makes mistakes in this, but I think it's because I play it on like 20-foot screens instead of just like a little television screen or computer monitor. But it's amazing, 40% of people missed a detail as big as the gorilla walking across the screen. But that's been pretty clearly demonstrated. They've also done this with radiologists. So they did it with radiologists with PECTs. And they put a gorilla, like one of those little chain monkeys that look like this, you know, they put one of those in one of the pulmonary arteries. And they had them go through the CT, and the number was like 60% missed the gorilla in the pulmonary artery because they weren't looking for it. It wasn't part of what their brain was processing, and they were putting so much effort into what they're doing, they missed what was going on around them. And actually in this video, one of the players gets hit right in the face with a basketball and almost knocks her glasses off. I saw the video about 100 times before I noticed that for the first time. So that is another example of what we miss when we're loaded or cognitively overloaded with other things. And you'll feel this on shift. There'll be shifts where you're seeing 20 patients and it's just hopping and everything's firing on all cylinders and you feel great and you don't miss a step. And then you'll go to work the next day and the wheels are falling off, you're only seeing 10 patients, you're not nearly as busy, but for some reason it's just not clicking. It's usually because your patients don't fit into your heuristic boxes you've made. And so you'll have a problem with fewer patients because they're not as neatly boxed as other patients sometimes. So all of this goes into then cognitive load theory. So this is cognitive load theory and the components that make it up. So and I'm going to augment this a little bit, but this is traditional cognitive load theory. So this is intrinsic load. So intrinsic load is the basic complexity of the problem. It's whether it's a simple problem or an easy problem. Is it 2 + 2 or 17 × 24? Extraneous load is the load that we put on the learner by the way we're teaching them at the time. And this can be a patient, this can be a resident, this can be a nurse, anybody we're trying to educate. And then the Germain load is basically it's the cognitive overhead they have left to process the problem. So if it's a simple problem, it doesn't have very high intrinsic load, and you've taught it well, so there's not much extraneous load, and they know the problem well and they know how to solve it, it doesn't take much Germain load, you can solve multiple problems in serial and go through things pretty rapidly. But if any one of these things fills you to cognitive capacity, then you lose your ability to solve problems and function outside of the one problem you're trying to solve. So we'll apply this to the emergency department a little bit here with intrinsic load. So for many people, myself included, when I walk into a room like this, my intrinsic load goes down, but for our junior learners, that's what happens. So our medical students and our residents go into a room like that and they're completely overwhelmed. And I'll add to the intrinsic load of our environment a couple other things. I think you have to take into effect the things that happen outside of work for that person as well. On their way to work today, did their dog run away? Did they think they forgot to turn off the stove? Did they get in a fight with their spouse? Did they not get enough sleep? All those things stack up and make their cognitive load higher, and they fill up their cognitive capacity in a much more rapid fashion. So for our new residents or our consultants too, who come down into our environment, it's not a natural environment for them, this is what happens to their intrinsic load. It explodes. Little sensitive buzzer here. Versus many of us who love the emergency department for its chaos, intrinsic load actually decreases when we get into an environment, and I'll talk about that with a little graph here. So I'll give a trigger warning. It is impossible to talk about this without it sounding sexual. So it's just going to sound sexual, and you're going to have to be mature adults and laugh appropriately. So this is an experiment they did with level of arousal, basically how engaged you are with your performance. And what we find is that everybody has a performance arousal graph. So they have a point where down here they're bored, they're not very engaged, and they're not performing very well. So this is 7:30 in the morning on a Sunday in the emergency department. Nobody's in the waiting room. Maybe it's snowing outside. In St. Louis, if it snows, everybody stays home because they're terrified of the snow. I'm from North Dakota, so I love the snow. I think it's ridiculous. But anyway, you get that, then that one patient comes in the waiting room, and you're like, ugh, I got to go see that one patient. And it's because you're down here in this low level of arousal, so you're not performing very, very efficiently yet. But then things start to pick up, and by 2 or 3, the waiting room's full, you're seeing a bunch of patients, and you're now in this high performance range. So this is when you're just hammering out patients one by one, you're going room to room to room to room, and you're seeing a ton of people. And then you get that level 1 in that code, and they kind of derail you, and they put you over your limit. And suddenly you're off the rails, and you start to lose efficiency. And this is when you see, I'll just pick on residents because they're easy targets. Sorry, Brandon. We'll pick on the ones who aren't here. You'll see that it's where they're just like, should I put in the orders? Should I go see the new patient? Maybe I should go look at that chest x-ray. And you're like, just put it on the list and start checking off boxes, okay? Slow down and start checking off boxes. So it's good to recognize that this is how we function and how we perform. It's more important, I think, though, to recognize that not everybody's the same. So this might be my internal medicine rotator's arousal curve, but this is my arousal curve. So it takes more to get me excited, but I last longer. I warned you. I'm getting in my 50s. It's all right. So you have to recognize that some people need to have more to do before they get excited, or they need to be more interested in what's going on before they get engaged and efficient, but they can perform in a more chaotic environment. So this is IM and EM, two stereotypical examples of that. But I think you also have to recognize that you do have some superstars out there, so it doesn't take much to get them excited, and they can really perform efficiently for a long period of time over a heavy cognitive load. So these are like the rock star ER docs who can last forever, and they can work an overnight 12-hour shift and see a ton of patients without a problem. But of course, if they're superstars, there's duds too. So along with that, you will see people who take more to get going and they fall off the rails faster. And when they fall off the rails, they like fall off the rails. There's no gentle glide slope anymore. They're just falling apart. So one of the things to know about this or to recognize is when you see people start to lose control because they're cognitively overloaded, it's time to have them pull back. When the intern's got 3 patients and they're drowning with 3 patients, it's not time to throw another patient at them and say, like, go work harder. You got more people to see. That's like throwing a baby to a drowning person, right? If you've heard the joke, it's like you know, what's having a 5th kid like? It's like drowning and then having someone throw a baby on top of you. So that's what you're just drowning them further with this patient. So there's no reason to give them more work, because what happens is they were here and now they're here because you gave them one more patient to do. So now they're not taking care of 4 patients okay. They're not taking care of any patients anymore. You're taking care of all 5 of their patients because they can't handle it and you can't trust them. So you're much better off kind of trying to get them nestled right into this spot and keep them there where they can operate efficiently. They can still learn and get experience out of this, and you know patients are being taken care of well, and you have to help take care of a few on your own. So we'll talk a little bit now about extraneous load. So this is the load that we put on the learner by how we teach them. And I think that this is a really important thing that we can control as educators. And even if you work in more of a community environment, your patients are part of this problem. So we'll pick on, I'll pick on the superstar in the t-shirt here. Ken Milne, can you describe this triangle to me?
Caution.
Just caution, that's it?
Caution.
All right, you want me to reproduce it, and I can't see it. So describe the triangle so I can reproduce it.
It looks like an equilateral triangle. It's yellow.
Okay, any more descriptors we can use for this? Audience? Size, so we could talk about how big it is, the orientation, things like that. Okay? So that, you can do that verbally. We could get through it. I could probably reproduce it. But what if you had to describe that problem to me verbally without me looking at it? Much more complicated. Things are different orientations, they're different colors, they're different kinds of triangles, they're different sizes of triangles. So what's the best way to get this message across to a learner? Throw it out to the audience. We picked on that side, so we'll pick on this side. How can I teach this most efficiently? Break it up in pieces, okay. How about something else, even simpler? Huh? Yeah, so I think you guys are kind of thinking the same thing. How about I just show a picture? Be like, hey, I want you to draw these triangles. There's the picture, copy it. We do this to patients all the time. We go into their rooms and we say, yeah, so your blood pressure is low, so I think we're going to have to put this central line in you. And they're like, they look at you confused, like, oh, they don't know what a central line is, so I'll explain it to them. It's this giant IV that we're going to put under your collarbone. It's going to go into this blood vessel that goes to your heart. And they're like, I have no idea what you're saying. When you could just pull up your phone, pull up a picture of a central line in a patient, show them a quick YouTube video, learners themselves, if you've never done one, like go look at YouTube for 15 minutes, and then we'll come do the central line. So thinking about the way to deliver the message in its most efficient manner is really important when we're teaching our residents, but even our patients. They really need us to really reel things back and tell them things in normal kind of human terms and not our doctor lingo. So then finally there's the Germain load, which is the complexity of the problem, and that really depends on people's exposure to the problem. So as I said before, if you're operating in System 2, that takes a lot more cognitive function. If you do System 2 problems often enough, if you do a problem often enough, it goes from System 2 to System 1. And I actually had a debate when we were talking about the arousal curves with somebody. I believe that the arousal curves are established and set. So everybody has this area under the curve in which they can operate efficiently. And all we do is, with experience, compartmentalize the complexity of the things we do in the emergency department so that we can fit more things under that cognitive curve. So the new learners, they're not able to do less because they haven't grown their curve yet. They just haven't figured out the heuristics to keep everything compartmentalized. All right, so we'll watch another video, and I think when we teach learners, and if you haven't seen this, this is from Sherlock Holmes. It's my favorite movie analogy to what we do in the emergency department. So this is what our learners see when they watch us in the emergency department. code comes in, we resuscitate them, we do CPR, we recognize they have a pericardial effusion, we take 60 cc's of fluid off their heart, we bring them back, we intubate them, and it's all over in 15 minutes. And the med students and interns are left like, how the hell did that happen? They can't keep up with what's going on when what's really happening under the hood looks more like this.
First, distract target. Then block his blind jab. Counter with cross to left cheek. Discombobulate. Dazed, he'll attempt wild haymaker. Employ elbow block. And body shot. Block ferrule left. Weaken right jaw. Now fracture. Break cracked ribs. Traumatize solar plexus. Dislocate jaw entirely. Heel kick to diaphragm. In summary, ears ringing, jaw fractured, 3 ribs cracked, 4 broken, diaphragm hemorrhaging. Physical recovery 6 weeks. Full psychological recovery 6 months. Capacity to spit it back of head neutralized.
And what's even more interesting is that we don't know that that's happening under the hood. So there's a thing called the curse of mastery, and it's the further you get from the origin of your knowledge, the less you can recall the path that got you there. So this happens to the attendings all the time, where the med students are like, I don't understand how you knew to do that and how it worked. And you're like, are you asking me to explain the metabolic pathway? Are you asking me to tell you what channels these drugs work on? And we've lost this chain that got us there. Or if you think about the just the heuristics we build to recognize what's coming next when a patient's coding. Things like, I think decompensated heart failure is another good example. Like, we know that if we get that patient in time, we put them on BiPAP, you start them on these massive nitro drips, within 30 minutes they're turned right around and they look great and they're off BiPAP very often. If you've never seen that happen, you have no idea that it's even possible, because the patients look so bad when they show up. So we have a lot of trouble explaining how we are where we are to the new learners. And so what I always recommend is having the person that's a step above the learner be a part of that teaching process, because they still remember what it was like to have a foot in medical school or in residency. So I think it's just something to be aware of. All right. So one of the things that happens in our emergency department is that when we reach cognitive overload, we lose our ability to function in System 1. We talked about that a little bit before. So one of the things you can do to help with that is what's called stress inoculation. So I'm, again, a former military guy, I guess current military guy. The Army's the military and the Air Force really isn't. I'm in the Air Force now, so it's completely different. The military does this all the time. So I didn't even really realize when I was in the Army, while I was going through the process, that they were stress inoculating me. And it sounds dumb to say, but I didn't realize they were teaching me how to kill people. Like, that never really, I was an infantryman. Like, it never occurred to me that I was being taught to be a killer. And they do this very well. And actually, the Army has psychiatrists whose job it is to figure out how to teach people these techniques without it really being readily apparent. You think you're there learning how to protect your buddies. You protect your buddies by sending bullets the other way. So they did studies in World War II, or through the wars, on rates of fire. So if you're not familiar with rates of fire, it's, if I give you a rifle and put you in battle, will you shoot it? And in World War I, rates of fire were in the teens. So most people, the vast majority of people who were given a rifle never fired it. They would hide in the trenches, they wouldn't engage. And it's because, despite what the media might try to tell us, we're not wired to kill each other. That's not something that's innate in our nature. You have to be taught that, and you have to lose some part of your humanity. Lose might be the wrong way to say it, but you're doing an unnatural thing, and you have to learn how to do that. So in World War II, they started using silhouettes instead of just paper targets. So in World War I, they just had like the circle targets. In World War II, they used human silhouettes. Rates of fire went up into the 40s. So dramatic increase, but still over half of your units not firing their weapon. So in the Vietnam era, they actually made the targets look like people. And now in my era, you actually shoot at people. You use airsoft rifles and things like that, and you actually engage in real combat with fake bullets. And now our rates of fire are at 98%. So we've seen that by exposing you to a stressful thing, you can teach people how to operate in that stressful environment in a better way. I do a lot of SIM education, and SIM is a great way to do that. Any SIM educators in the room? Anybody play with SIM? I encourage you, if you're using SIM, don't use SIM in a sim lab all the time. You have to get out of the lab, and you have to put people in the environment where they function so that they know, when I need a chest tube, it lives here, because when I'm stressed out about this case and they need a chest tube and they're crashing, my brain can't think, where is the chest tube? All my brain can do is operate in system 1. So I have to use system 1 to find that chest tube. And that's an important part of doing in situ simulation. So stress inoculation is an important factor that you have to think about, and if you're doing any intern work, as they get into your new environment when they start in July, get them exposed to the department. Don't make them take care of crashing patients, but let them be a part of taking care of crashing patients, and they will be able to start to stress inoculate when they have to take over taking care of those really sick patients in a year or so. So one of the things that we can do to help with stress inoculation, I'm sorry, my throat demands water. One of the things we can do is a little bit of meditative effort if we feel ourselves getting stressed. So there's a couple of breathing techniques that I like, one in particular, when I recognize that I or one of my learners is getting stressed. So the first one is called, it's called sniper breathing. So it's repeated cyclical breathing. I think it takes a little while and it's a little obvious, but it's breath in and then 3 times the breath out. So 3 times exhale versus inhale. And you just do that repeatedly until you feel your stress level go down. So that's one technique. If you're preparing for something and you're nervous, like you're going to give a talk and you're a little stressed out, you can do that. I think in a trauma bay, it's a little obvious. So I like to do what's called a stack breath. And stack breathing it's 3 breaths. So your first breath, I want you to take as much air as you can in your lungs and have you play along. So big breath as much as you can get. And then get more. A little more. And let it all out. And there's something about that third breath, when the second one you feel like really like, I got it all, I filled my lungs, but there's something about that little bit more you get in that third breath that just kind of hits a reset button. And you'll see people's heart rates just drop once they hit that third breath. Some people believe it's a vagal response because you're basically creating so much intrathoracic pressure, you're creating a vagal response. And then some people actually like to add a trigger breath to it. So when you take that last breath, you do like that. It's called a trigger breath, and that what you're doing is kind of closing your glottis, so you're actually increasing your intrathoracic pressure just a hair more when you do it. So those are a couple of techniques. The second technique, you can do that in a trauma bay. Most people probably won't notice because everybody's yelling and it's chaotic. If you have a gown and gloves on, nobody's going to notice you're doing that. So it's something I'll do with my residents before procedures if I notice that they're nervous or shaking. Because one of the first things that goes when you get stressed is your ability to do fine motor movements. So you're in a chaotic environment, you're trying to put a central line on a crashing patient, and you're getting tremors because you're stressed, the exact time you don't want to. And I didn't really realize this when I was a younger educator, and I learned this actually from the book On Combat, where some of those statistics come from, because this is what happens in combat. When my airway's my thing, when my residents would try to intubate, and they would start fumbling, and if you look at anesthesia literature on this, the longer it takes you to intubate, the more wild your movements get. So they put a dot on a laryngoscope, and they measured the movement of the dot. And what you see is, if you're an expert, the laryngoscope goes in, it goes up, the tube goes in, and you're done. As time goes on, you start to do this. And then as you start to get stressed, you lose your fine motor, so you can't really use your fingers anymore. So it's all just like biceps and triceps, and it's these big, giant movements. And so you just see on this graph, the dot starts to go all over the place. So know that's happening when you're getting stressed, and have your residents or yourself maybe sometimes just do a quick deep breath. It takes 5 seconds and you're done, and it'll help you out a lot. So we have a few minutes left. So I always put a few games at the end of this, but before we do a few mind games, I'd like to just open up to any questions. Does the audience have any questions right now? No questions? One question?
No question. So you talked a lot about clinical operations, making decisions in the clinical setting. We derive those decisions from research. In the research world, 3,500 biomedical publications every single day popping up on PubMed. Few of them give you a clear type 1, type 2 breakdown of how to digest this new information. Have you seen that done well in the research world, where we take the research reports and digest them for all clinicians to be able to absorb quickly and use both systems of thinking?
I don't know that there's a measured system for that. I mean, I think what Ken does is an example of that. It probably just reaches us as emergency physicians. where you do your knowledge translation, trying to minimize that curve. I think spoon feed is a good example of that too, but I can't tell you the metrics they use or the system they use to try to filter that vast information down into something digestible. But if you haven't looked at it yet, spoon feed is a daily email you can get that has some great information in it, and they take an article a day. Yep.
You may be talking about some of the research coming out in Tetris.
In Tetris?
Yeah. So this is, I first heard this, I was like, there's no way that's true.
Do you mean like do you see Tetris blocks everywhere you go? Is that what you're talking about?
So the Tetris game,
Okay.
going back to the neuroscience,
Mm-hmm.
somehow how we do long-term memory with the visual going into long-term memory, it's the same track. So if you go home after a really bad shift and you play Tetris, it's supposed to decrease your long-term memory of that day and maybe decrease PTSD. And there's actually trials of this, and it's wild.
I'll have to look at that.
So Tetris app for your residents after a really crappy shift.
Yeah, I'll have to look at that. Question is, do you lose the good with the bad? I don't know, but
That's always the question.
I'm actually just starting to work with a PhD researcher he's a PhD student who's doing work on stress inoculation and stress response in PTSD with vets. So he has a few games he has them do, so I'll have to investigate that. Thanks.
So on your level of arousal and performance graph,
Mm-hmm.
had high performers and low performers based on kind of their makeup, their cognitive makeup, and what they're able to tolerate. In residency training, we don't really have room for that. It's like at PGY level, we expect you at this point to be here. At PGY 2, we expect you to be here. And if you're not great by PGY 3, we put you in different categories. I guess there are two questions. One, is there research where we can modify, that kind of baseline graph which people are at, kind of get them at least 1 degree better? Or two, should we be modifying the way in which we train people so that people recognize where they're at and not kind of beat them up for where they genetically are at, and try to kind of get them to a place where our systems support them through that?
I think if you ever go to CORD, the meeting for residency directors, there's a big effort to remediate people who are having problems, and I think residents view remediation as punishment. Remediation is what your entire residency is about. You're remediating the day you walk in the door as a resident, and all you're trying to do is get better. And the problem is that it takes customized curriculum, and there's not money for that, and there's oftentimes not time for that. That's not an excuse, it's just a reality. There's also been a lot of talk about not doing straight resident tracks where you start on day one as an intern and you graduate 3 years later as a senior, that you actually allow people to graduate up levels as you would in the rest of the business world. As you get more competent, you get rewarded for that. The problem is that we have this pipeline that we need a set number of people in the pipeline at any given time. So it's absolutely what should be happening. I think seeing it in action is more difficult. But we try to do customized curriculum for residents that we see struggling or shadow shifts and things like that to help them get more efficient. Because again, you're not changing the curve, you're just helping them get more inside their curve. Other questions? We'll have time we'll do a few games here and kind of apply them clinically. So we've all seen this before. These lines we know are the same length. If we put them together, they're the same length. Despite knowing this, when we look at it, we see two lines that are the different length. So this is applying system 2 to help override a problem that you already know. So your system 1 looks at this and says, two different lengths. Your system 2 says, no, I've seen this before. These are actually the lines that are the same length. But if you're overwhelmed, you have trouble overriding that system 1 response that always comes right out of the gate. Sorry. All right, so this is a little audio game. This is, I guess, a little similar to the one I played at the beginning of this, and I just have you listen to this again. Oh, what happened to my audio?
So what
There we
you'll
go.
hear is a sentence, a spoken sentence, that's been transformed by a computer to sound like gibberish. So, any idea what they said?
No.
Okay, you can hear it one more time. Okay, now we'll hear the real sentence.
The Constitution Center is at the next stop.
Does it make sense that time?
Yeah, wait, was that the
It
same?
was the exact same sentence that you heard the first time.
No way.
All right. The response from the audience when I play this is always the same. There's always that like soft chuckle when they all get it. So this is an example of how your prior experience imprints your next experience. And I think our best example of this is like that, hey, do you remember that patient you saw 2 days ago? We all hate that, right? Like, this never ends with like, oh, they gave you flowers. So it's like, yeah, you missed an aortic dissection and he came back coding. And you're like, oh. So then for like 6 months, a year, the rest of your career, every chest pain, belly pain is an aortic dissection and they all get a CT scan, right? So you've imprinted that information onto the way you treat that problem. So it's an important thing to recognize in yourself. I think also it's important to recognize that when you present patients upstairs, they haven't been imprinted yet by this patient that you're looking at in the emergency department. You're seeing the patient and you've had an experience with them, even if it's only been a couple of hours, that they haven't had yet. And you have to somehow communicate that imprint onto the people upstairs to get them to buy in to taking care of this used car that they don't want. And that's why we're all used car salesmen. We're just selling cars that nobody's trying to buy. All right, so this is the father of our country. Let's see, we'll pick on this side over here. I'm going to pick on something. All right, you made eye contact. You're my victim. All right, when was George Washington born? Don't Google it. Give me your best guess. (1754). Why did you say 1754? Okay. So what's one big point in history that we know Washington for? Okay, in the Revolutionary War, usually that's what people think about. So, or the Declaration of Independence. 1776 is a date that just sticks in our heads. So we think, okay, 1776, he had to be at least so old. He was a general. We're going to go back a few years. So 1738 is when he was born. So you're in the ballpark, right? We're talking hundreds of years. You got within a dozen or so. So pretty close on your guess. So that's something that's called the anchoring heuristic. It's taking prior information that we have and applying it to the patient we're taking care of now. So sometimes that's that section again, that aortic dissection that isn't there, but we're looking for it everywhere now. All right, so this is a question that they asked a group of people, followed by another group that was asked this question. So did Mahatma Gandhi live beyond age 9? Did he die at age 140? And then they asked both groups, or did he live beyond 140, sorry, how old was he when he died? And these were the answers that they got. So statistically different answers based on whether you were asked 140 or 9. So this is something called the anchoring bias or nudging. And just by being asked this bigger number, you give a bigger number as a response. And then the last one I'll leave you with is the bat and ball problem. So a bat and a ball cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? First answer that comes to your head. 10 cents, right? Everyone thinks 10 cents. I've done this problem 100 times. I think 10 cents every time I do it. It just makes sense that it's 10 cents. But if it's 10 cents and the bat's $1 more, then it's $1.20 total, so that doesn't work. So it's actually 5 cents. So 5 cents, $1 more is $1.05, $1.10. That's, again, a closing example of our system 2 overriding our system 1. Your system 1 wants the quick and easy answer, but you have to say no to that and not acknowledge it and go back to your system 2 and look for the more complex answer. And I think I'll end here. I'm 5 minutes over already. This is just another example of anchoring bias where they ask the last 2 of your social, and then you bid on bottles of wine. And again, statistically significant difference in the bottles you bid on. All right, now I'm going to leave the rest. I just always leave extra time depending on how much you guys talk. And then this is a reading list. So I'm not going to leave you with a bunch of literature, but all of these are very well sourced. So these are some reading and listening lists. If any of this was entertaining to you, these are some great resources. All right, and I will open it up to questions and unless the other speaker's here. Or maybe there's nobody else. Thank you.